Greetings, guys. My name is Jotman, and we're back into another Bible breakdown today. This time it's going to be Genesis chapters 10 through 17. So we're just going to hop right on into it. Starting in Genesis 10, verse 1 through 8, it just talks about the generations of Noah. And verses 9 through 12, it talks about Nimrod the hunter, how he was a great hunter, and it goes on to describe Nimrod's kingdom. And verses 13 through 18, it just talks about more generations of Noah. And verse 19, it talks about the land of the Canaanites. And then in verses 20 through 32, it then again talks about more generations of Noah. On to Genesis 11, and this is the part of the Tower of Babel. And it starts in verse 1, how everybody speaks the same language. And then in verses 2 to 8, they plan to build a big tower up to the heavens. In verses 5 through 9, God sees this and decides to mix up all the languages on earth and scatters men across the globe because of this. And it even says, therefore in the name called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the languages of earth, and thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. So this was in response to them trying to build the tower, and God didn't want them to build the tower. And then in verses 10 through 32, it just goes through the generations of Shem. On to Genesis 12, in verses 1 and 3, the Lord commands Abram to leave and promises him blessings and a great nation. Now I'm using Abram right now because his name hasn't been changed to Abraham yet. In verses 4 through 6, Abram leaves into the land of Canaan. In verses 7 and 8, Abram builds an altar to God. In verses 9 and 10, Abram journeys into Egypt. In verses 11 through 16, Abram tells Sarai to pretend to be his sister. Because Sarai is really, really pretty, and Sarai, by the way, is Sarah, but again, their names haven't been changed yet. So he's worried that the Pharaoh or any Egyptian will kill him just to take Sarai as their wife. So he tells Sarai to pretend to be his sister, and then in response, Pharaoh actually takes Sarai and then gives Abraham all these gifts, just in response because he thinks it's his sister. So it says, say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, and thou will with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. So basically he's pleading with Sarai to act like a sister so he doesn't die. And verses 17 through 20, the Lord ends up plaguing the Pharaoh because of this. And then the Pharaoh figures out that Sarai is not Abraham's sister, but rather Abram's wife. And then they are commanded to leave. In Genesis 13, Abram does leave Egypt. In verse 2, it talks about Abram's wealth. In verse 3, Abram continues his journey. In verse 4, Abram goes back to the altar that he built. And in verse 5 and 7, or 5 through 7, Abram and Lot, which is one of Abram's companions, has a big blowout over the land because there's just not enough land for both of them to kind of share at this point because of their herds. So in verses 8 through 9, Abram offers Lot a compromise, and the compromise is not the whole land before thee. Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me, and thou wilt take the left hand, and I will go to the right. Or thou depart to the right, and I will go to the left. So basically, Abram's saying, okay, you go one way, and I'll go the other. I don't care which way you pick. I'll just go opposite of you. And they do. So because Lot chose to go to the east towards the river, or towards the land of Jordan, and the two just completely separate. In verse 12 through 13, Abram stays in Sodom, but they were wicked, and this is a warning. So it says, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So we're going to get onto that later, probably in the next video, but do keep that verse in mind about Sodom and Gomorrah. So in verse 14 through 17, the Lord offers Abram land and land for his offspring. In verse 18, Abram travels to Hebron and builds an altar to the Lord yet again. Then we're on to Genesis 14. And in Genesis 14, it talks about a great war. In verses 1 through 10, it tells how there was a war between Elzar, Elam, and the trident king of the nations. And eventually they drove the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah out. And when the kings drove, or when Chedorlaomer, I don't know how to spell his name, basically the king of Elam, when he drove those guys out, he took Abraham's nephew and a bunch of Abraham's brother's stuff. And then verses 13 through 16, Abraham brought an army together off of his people, and they went and they got all of his brother's stuff back. The king of Sodom blessed Abraham for slaughtering Chedorlaomer, and then all was well. And in Genesis 15, the Lord, verses 1 through 6, the Lord promises Abram a son. And at this point, the Lord communicates to Abram, giving him warnings and promises of the future. And one of those warnings is, and he said unto Abram, know of a certainty that thy seed will be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. Now this is a prophecy. We'll probably get into this later, but it's basically telling Abram that, hey, yeah, there is going to be bad stuff that happens to your generations after you. And in verses 18 through 21, the Lord makes a covenant with Abram. In Genesis 16, verse 1, Sarah still has no children. So in response to this, in verses 2 through 5, Sarah tells Abram to go get her maid Hagar pregnant. And Abram did. He went and got Hagar pregnant, and Sarai was very displeased with this, and from that point on despised Hagar. And so in response, Sarai drove Hagar away. Now Hagar fled, and this is when she was confronted by an angel in verses 7 through 14. The angel told Hagar to go back, and Hagar was to have a son named Ishmael. And the Lord would make this son very successful, and he does. And in verses 15 and 16, Hagar actually bore Ishmael. Now that brings us into Genesis 17. And the Lord, in verses 1 through 9, appears to Abram and establishes a new covenant. And he also changes his name to Abraham. And it says, neither shall thy name be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham, for thee are the father of many nations I have made thee. So this is basically him setting up Abraham to be the father of nations. And then in verses 10 through 14, he actually describes the covenant to Abraham. And it says, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. So basically, circumcision is going to be kind of the mark of the covenant between Abraham and the Lord. And verse 15, God changes Sarai's name to Sarah. And then in verses 16 through 19, God promises that Sarah will bear Abraham a child. In verse 20, God promises Ishmael will bring forth a great nation. And then verses 21 through 22, God tells Abraham that the covenant will be between Isaac and not Ishmael. So basically, Ishmael is going to be out of the picture, and Isaac is going to be the one that kind of bears Abraham's name and keeps the covenant. And then in verses 23 through 27, Abraham upholds the covenant by circumcising everybody in his house. And by house, it means everybody of his party and anybody in that situation. And that is the end of Genesis 17. So let me know what you guys think, how I can improve these videos, how I can make these videos better. I hope you guys learned a lot, and come back and stay tuned. So until then, I will see you guys in the next video, and I hope everybody has a great day or night or whatever you're doing. Thanks for watching.